question I've already had from one of the students here is that my reference for most of these paintings starts, I base the color on WPA imagery of the West, as well as Hudson River School imagery of the West. And I try to give the theme of the pastoral landscape a twist in light of climate change and in light of just the contemporary world not being, there was in the Hudson River School imagery, there was a sense of potential and hope for the future, and I'm kind of turning that around in the imagery. I teach life drawing, and I most like drawing from the human figure, but I'm making the choice to paint landscapes in order to make imagery that I can, as a white person, make relevant to the world we have today. And I'm not sure I have a whole lot else to add to that. The format of these paintings is largely due to you'll notice that most of these paintings are the same size and scale. That has partly to do with the ease of shipping the show, frankly. In my studio, I have works in progress that are on the same theme, but at a much larger scale, that were cost prohibitive to ship to this show. So it's an ongoing theme, and I expect to continue to learn about color. I've never learned so much about color as I have in this series, and so I expect to work in that direction and investigate those same kinds of themes as I progress.
Thank you. Guys, you have questions for him? Something.
I have a question.
Good.
My question is, so Robert, when you are painting smaller things for the very legitimate reasons that you said, but you're also working bigger, what's some of the main things you notice with the scale? Does it change the kind of story you can tell? How does it change the painting of it?
The small painting, I like the small format because it's more intimate. I incorporate a lot of drawing skill in my painting. It's not very gestural or painterly as a lot of my peers would work. And the small scale relates more to drawing for me. But as I push myself, and it is a push, to paint larger, it's a challenge to think in that scale and to work in that scale. I try, when I go larger, I try to maintain some of that detail, and that just takes so much longer. So it's exhausting to work at a large scale for very long, so part of the impetus for the small paintings is to have smaller things that go faster while I'm working on large paintings.
Could you speak a little to your content? What you're saying with these landscapes? They're very quiet.
They are. There is a subtext to these works. I'm reading a book now that the Solace of Fierce Landscapes, and there's a subtext to this whole theme that I relate to in terms of my spiritual walk. The desert and the mountain are both themes from Scripture, where sites where significant meetings with God took place. The Sermon on the Mount, for instance, Christ cast into the wilderness, the burning bush, Moses in the wilderness. So the barren landscape relates to that for me. And so it's not just, these really aren't landscapes that exist. They are landscapes that are partly imaginary, based in reality and extrapolated through imagination and a combination of still life imagery in the foreground to lend a kind of authority to the image, and then an invented background and an invented light to give a context for that information. So,
Can I ask a question about, so if you have, if the landscape is a place where one meets God, how does that connect to the fact that they're all very much also about climate change, right? And about, and depressing in that way, I mean, I sort of think of the way in which the, oceans are heating up, or the landscape is getting sort of ravaged as a depressing subject, but the idea of going into that place and meeting God is not a depressing subject. So can you talk about that a little bit?
We often have experiences with God in times of crisis and times of stress. And that's how I see the tie between the two themes. So I primarily, in a secular setting, I probably wouldn't really talk about the spiritual aspect of the work, and I don't need to. I can talk about this work just in terms of making a desolate image beautiful through color. I can talk about this work just in terms of the changing landscape, the American West as seen in car commercials as the backdrop for truck commercials, seeming very pastoral, and I'm taking that and turning it on its head. And so that's primarily how I talk to other artists about this work, but there is a more personal level to the work as well. And typically that's the case, that I don't always talk about those more personal meanings, but this is a safe setting.
I have one more question for you. The water ones are turbulent, totally opposite.
Yes, they are. Again, I can talk about that in terms of rising sea level, or I can talk about that in terms of in the Old Testament, the construction of the temple, outside in one of the courtyards was a bowl called the sea, and the temple stands as a metaphor for the New Testament body of the believer as the temple of the Holy Spirit. And I always saw a connection to there being an emotional turbulence in me that related to the idea of the sea in the Old Testament temple design. So that's the connection that I make between the two for myself. And so calming that sea is an objective, part of why I paint. So
that should relate to the art therapy people here at the calming of the sea. That's pretty cool. Actually.
There is definitely a therapeutic element to my motivation.
Some of the students come from 2D design to painting. And so I was asking, which is more stressful? The 2D or the painting, because 2D is so exacting and then painting is a little bit freer. We haven't figured that out yet. Yeah. So if you guys have any questions about process, about how we paint, because you're right now working on painting, so.
I like the detail, like on your wings, like you can tell, like you said, like how you move to bigger canvases and smaller canvases. I could just imagine if the waves was on a bigger canvas, it would probably be way harder to get so much detail on a smaller canvas.
With those ocean paintings at a larger scale, I do start to get brushier. Partly because the water is never still, which is a comment I've gotten about these paintings is that they are unrealistic in that manner, right? And there is a little bit of an unrealistic element that comes into the imagery sometimes in this painting or in those first two ocean paintings. A strangeness that is off-putting. I'll allow that to come into the imagery sometimes also. Just to make the familiar unusual, to help capture your attention.
It does. Thank you for that question, Joseph.
Yeah, good question.
Anybody else? Questions? We have the artist standing here, not on a Zoom, so.
Do you have a favorite in the series?
I don't. My favorite is probably always the next one. I feel like I never quite get the image that I wanted to paint, and that's kind of always the case. And I keep trying to capture something else, an ideal that I never achieve.
So drawing is a lot different than painting. I came from drawing to painting. And I feel like painting you can't really get enough detail in. Do you have any like tips on making like how to get detail into painting because drawing is like
I do that by using smaller brushes, and I do that by working wet into wet, and that will help you manipulate the medium more easily. It'll allow the paint on the brush to flow and meld with the paint that's already down more easily. You can model more easily when it's wet into wet. So that's one thing I often do.
So if you like your trees, you're using a very fine brush.
Right. Like the detail in this painting. So really tiny, tight little brush, tight little painting. I just slow down and I'm just working very meticulously with a small brush. But I agree, it's in drawing, it's easier to control the medium, and then you have the challenge of the medium, and you have the added element of color. Drawing tends to be graphic, and painting tends to have color and texture as elements to the end product. So it is more challenging for those reasons.
On some of them, you have a central image. So not like this one, the central tree, that one, the central tree. This one takes you into the middle, so that makes it like the depth. Isn't that interesting? That one over there, the tree points us to the center.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Are you conscious of that, or it just sort of happens?
When I compose the image, I think photographically, and so I think about leading you into the space, and I think about I have a background in photography, and I think about composing in a viewfinder kind of way when I put the image together. That doesn't mean I start and finish with the same image, but that is part of how I think visually. This tree occurred very late stage in the painting, And it was a surprise to me, and it's a surprise to most people who look at that image, because it doesn't fit quite. There's no incidental shadows underneath the form, it just floats there. This foreground tree was the last thing I painted, and up until then, it had been a much deeper space, and then the insertion of that extreme foreground became a visual block to it, but it also became the focal point.
Yeah, I can't even imagine it without that.
Yeah. But so I sometimes work on a painting start to finish, but more typically I start a painting from the background working forward into the foreground, and the foreground happens last, and sometimes the foreground surprises even me.
How long is like the whole process for one painting? Like from
That's hard to say, because I work about 20 to 30 paintings at a time.
Ooh.
I'm really impatient. And so when I go into my studio, I kind of look around, you know, I have my cup of coffee, and I spend some time just looking before I do anything that day. And I look and try to identify, well, I kind of see something in this painting that I want to fix, or I just don't feel like rising to the occasion of, there's so much at stake in that painting, I don't feel like I'm up to it today, so maybe I'll just work on this one again. Or maybe I have some paint left over on my palette from yesterday. Where does it fit, right? There's lots of different decisions that come into why I paint multiple paintings all at once, but I'm too impatient to sit down and just paint an image start to finish, typically.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you so much. That was so informative. It really gave us insight into the work. The work was beautiful.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you